Okay guys, so I've got the engine ready to lay the crank. We got the cam in. Now one thing that you're going to notice, or one thing that I want to point out, is if you see how I have this engine sitting on the bench, one of the things that's important is now that I've got the valve train installed here, you'll notice I don't have the engine, the heads of the valves themselves sitting on the bench. I've got them raised up. I've got blocks of wood under the ends here and off of the valves. You don't want to lay the valves on anything because some of these valves are open now and you can bend them. So it's real important that you don't do that. Either put it on a stand or get it up off of the valves, away from the valve train here. Like I said earlier, we want to put the crank in, put some oil on it, torque the main caps on, and make sure that the crank rotates smoothly without any binding. And we want to do that before we put the rear main seal in, because this has a rope seal, and rope seals are very restrictive a lot of times when they're new, and it makes the crank hard to turn. So we don't want to have any kind of issues as far as we put it together and we're like, gosh, is it turning hard because the bearings are binding, or is it turning hard because I put the rope seal in? So we put the crank in, torque the mains without the rope seal, make sure it rotates, pull the crank back out, and like I said, we're still waiting for that rope seal. We should have it, I don't know, tomorrow or the next day. But at that point, we'll be ready to go ahead and final install the crank with the rope seal and then move on to the piston installation. So that's going to be my next step. All right, so the next thing we got here, you guys, is I've got the rear cap on, I've got the thrust bearing in there, and I've got it torqued. The next thing you need to do is you need to check your end play. Now, I've got a dial indicator on the back of the crank here, and we're going to pry the crank back and forth. So you can see that there's 0. I've got about 7 to 8 thousandths end play, which is really good. 6 to 10 is what they're looking for. So we're right in that spec there. 7 or 8 thousandths is good. If you ever put one of these together and the end play is too tight, I've actually had to slightly shave the flange surface of the bearing before on a belt sander. I didn't have to do that on this engine. It turned out really good. These are the OEM bearings, or new old stock. And these bearings were made, I don't know, 30 years ago. Even though they're new, usually the American made stuff that was made in America back in the day is pretty good quality, and you pretty much don't have any problem when you put them in. So we got really good end play. And then the other thing is, once you get all these caps on, this crankshaft needs to turn by hand. I mean, it needs to, there shouldn't be any binding. It shouldn't turn a quarter of a way and get hard. And this one doesn't. I got a bolt in the end of the crank here I can take, and I can just rotate this by hand, and this thing is just turning really nice, even though we've got this cap torqued. And then of course we're going to put our other caps on and do the same thing. I had the other caps on earlier and the thing turned really nice, so I know it turns with all the caps torqued. So yeah, it looks pretty good. So I'll get these other caps on, and then we can start putting our piston and rod assemblies in. Okay guys, so we've got all of the caps on, we've got them torqued, and I want you to notice, now we already checked the end play, you saw that a little bit earlier, but what I want you to notice here is I've got this bolt back here, and I am turning this crank with one finger. I'm literally just pushing on that with one finger, and I'm rotating it. The crank should turn nice and free, it should have end play, you shouldn't have any binding or any tight spots. I've seen videos on the internet where they're putting a crank in and they find a little tight spot in there, and I actually watched a video the other day and the guy's like, "God, don't worry about it, it'll loosen up when the engine runs." Well, yes it will, but what it's doing when it loosens up is it's taking material off of that tight spot or that bearing. So I mean, it's just best practice to make sure that this thing turns freely. It is not supposed to be tight at all. So if it's tight, something is wrong and you got to figure it out. You got to find out where it's binding and fix it. This one is beautiful, okay? Now that we've gotten that to that point, we got the crank in. The next step is we're going to start putting the slugs in. So I'm going to get this laid over on the side. We're going to do a little bit of clearance measuring on the piston and the cylinder wall. I've already done all that off camera, but I'm going to do it again because I want to demonstrate it. I've measured all the skirts, I've measured all the end gaps on the rings, everything is right where it needs to be. But I'm going to demo it just so you can see it for part of the video. So yeah, once I get this resituated over, we'll move on to piston installation. Okay guys, so just to remind you on the pistons, the piston has a heat slot or a heat dam on one side. That is going to go to the left side of the engine or the driver's side of the engine. So the driver's side of the engine is away from the valves and the cam. Now what's notable is you got your heat dam on this side, and on the other side you have an oil spurt hole right here on the rod. That oil spurt hole, when it goes in the engine, the driver's side is over here and the camshaft is over here on this side of the engine. That oil spurt hole that is opposite the heat dam faces the cam, and that helps to shoot oil out onto the camshaft and lifters to lubricate it. So that's the way it goes. And the bearing notches are on the same side as the oil spurt hole. These bearing notches or locating tangs in here, and those are also going to go toward the cam. So that's really the orientation that all of these go in. Now, what I did off camera is I checked the piston to cylinder wall clearance, but I'm going to do it again because I want you to see it. And we also checked all of the ring end gaps to make sure that they were correct. So first of all, on the ring end gaps, what you want to do, and this is our #1 piston here. So I'll just take this top piston ring off, and always use ring pliers for compression rings. You never want to roll these on. You want to keep them straight when you take them off. You want to keep those straight when you take them off. Now we're going to take our top ring and we're just going to go ahead and put it in the bore. I'm going to put this thing right in the bore. And I know that I've showed you this before, but it bears repeating. And I'll put the gap right at the bottom here, so hopefully you can see it a little better. Now, in order to check the ring end gap, what we have to do is we have to square the ring up. So I have the lower rings on the piston here. I'm just going to slide my piston in until I come in contact, or I come flush with that second ring against the deck. And now I have squared up my piston ring in there. So the general rule is you want about 4/1000 of end gap per inch of bore. These have a small bore. It's about 3 1/4 inch, a little less than 3 1/4. So if we take 3 1/4 times 4, we get about 13 1/2 minimum is what we're looking for. So we're going to set this up and we're going to look at that end gap and see what it was. We don't want to see any less than about 13 1/2 on this. So I'm going to start with a 14. That's a 14-inch feeler blade, and I'm just going to get it in there. And I know what these are because I've already checked them. And the 14 goes. It's a little snug, but it goes, so we're good there. I'm going to take the 15, and I'm going to put the 15 in there. And the 15 doesn't go. So we're about 14 thousandths. 13 1/2 is minimum, or where we should be. So we're about 14 thousandths end gap. And like I said, I've already checked all these, and they're all 14 1/2 thousandths, which is perfect for this bore size. So we know that that's right. But you always got to check that, because if your ring gaps are too tight, you're going to get yourself in trouble. All right, now we want to put this back on, and keep in mind, if the ring has a dot on top of it, it goes up. The top rings on this set does not have a dot, so it'll go either way. So we just keep that ring square with your ring pliers, expand it just enough to get it over the piston, get it back on there. Now also we want to stagger our ring gaps. So we've got both of these ring gaps right here. We're going to go ahead and leave that one there, and we're going to take the top gap and go to the other side with it. Now, the next thing is we're going to remove our cap, and we want to get our spray ring compressor on here. So we've already got our bearings in. We've already checked our clearances on our bearings. That's another thing is I did plastic gauge the rods on this, and they all came in right where they need to be. I didn't put the pistons in to do it. The nice thing about this is you can actually go from the back side and put the rod on and just let the piston lay on the table and plastic gauge it. It worked out pretty good. So we got about 1 3/4 to 2 thousandths clearance on all the rods, so we're good. Okay, now let's get our ring compressor on here. But one thing you want to do is you always want to coat the rings and piston with WD-40. And also I like to put a little WD-40 on the cylinder. Just get a little bit in there. Get some WD on your pistons. We don't want them going in dry, but you don't want thick oil on there. Get some oil on your bearing. You don't need a crazy large amount. You just want enough oil that you don't have metal to metal there. And we also need some kind of a journal protector. On the back side, we're going to take and put this guy on here, and this is going to go on the studs here. And what this does is it ensures that I'm not going to jam that stud into my crankshaft and gouge it or anything like that. All right, now the next step is our ring compressor. Now I generally like to use the cone style ring compressors, but I mean I definitely don't have a cone style ring compressor for this 3 1/4 inch bore, so we're going to use the band type. They work okay. They're just you gotta be a little more careful with these. So we're just going to adjust this to size that's comparable to our piston here. It's pretty small actually. Then we're just going to compress those rings. Adjust this to the point where it's good and snug. A little bit more. Okay, so now we've got our ring compressor on. We're going to go ahead and slide this in the bore, and remember your heat dam is going to go opposite the valves or to the driver's side. So we're very carefully going to install the rod, and also you want to make sure that your crank journal this is going on is at bottom dead center. In other words, it's away. So we're very carefully going to install this. We got our journal away from us here. And we're just going to slide the piston in and get it started in the bore. Now once the piston is started in the bore, then we're going to go to the back side and we're going to put our journal protector on. So right back here, again, we've got this at bottom dead center, and our connecting rod journal is in there. But what we want to do is we want to take, and I'll put a little light on that. There's our rod down in there. We want to take and we want to put this journal protector right over those studs, so that now we have a guide for this to come on to the connecting rod, and we also are not going to damage this. So then we take a soft hammer, you come up here, and then we just go into the bore with that cylinder, with that piston. Now that the piston's in, you just very gently and carefully run that right onto your journal. We're going to take our cap. You want to put a little bit of oil on the cap as well. So we're going to oil the cap up and make sure that the cap goes on in the right orientation. The bearing notch on the cap, which is right there, that notch is going to go to the same side as the notch here. Now the notch on this is going to be toward the cam. It's the same size as the spurt hole, so the notches are going to be to this side of the block here where the valve train is. And if you look right there, you can see that the notch on the rod is on this side as well. So that goes on with both notches to this side of the rod toward the cam. And you're going to get your nuts on there, torque them down, and you're in business. Now remember, there's also a couple of lock washers that go on here. You want to make sure you use those washers here. Don't leave those off. That was the OEM deal on these rods. Chrysler did that for a reason. They need to go back on there. Torque on the connecting rods on the Chrysler Flathead is 45 foot-pounds. So now we're going to run these in. Now you want to pull these up evenly. I'm not going to go to full torque on this one. I'm going to go about a third of the way. Get the other one snugged up. If you have to, you can go 3 different settings on here. I've been doing this long enough, I can tell. I can split it in 3 without setting the wrench. So there's about a third of the way. Go back to this one. Go about half torque. There we go. And then we're going to go to full torque on the third step here. There's your click. Okay, now we've got the first rod torqued. Another thing that we need to do, every time you get a connecting rod in this engine and you torque it, you need to rotate the crank and make sure there's no binding. So get the rod in one at a time, torque them one at a time, and rotate the crankshaft to make sure there's no problems with potential problems with that bearing. So we'll rotate this crank around and see how she feels. It feels really good. No binding. There's going to be a little bit of resistance when you put a piston in, but you shouldn't have any kind of binding. Each piston's going to make the rotation a little bit harder because of the resistance of the rings, but what you're really looking for is a hard spot or a bind or something, and this doesn't have that. Feels really good. And there you have it. So we checked the side clearance, we checked the piston to wall clearance, we checked the oil clearance. Everything's right on the money. And at that point, you just assemble the rest of the pistons. Now, like in so many of my other videos, I'm not going to let the camera roll while I put all 6 of these in. That would just be silly. If you really want to see this entire build on this engine, rewind the camera 6 times and just rewatch that over 6 times, and you'll see. Basically, it's the same thing. So I'm going to get all these other pistons in. After that, then we just start buttoning up the little things on it. There's a lot of little things that have to be hooked up and done. I won't do all of that on camera. I do want to do the valve adjustment. I haven't adjusted the valves yet. In fact, the lifters are backed all the way off. I don't usually adjust the valves until after I get the rotating assembly in and so forth. So I'll get the rest of the pistons in and I'll be back and we will move on. Okay guys, we got the short block together. We got all of our piston and rod assemblies in. All of the connecting rods are torqued and the engine turns over very nicely. No binding. Now, you're going to notice that it is a little stiffer once you get all the pistons in, but the reality is that you're just looking for any kind of binding or anything. We don't have any of that, and we know our clearances are good, so turned out really nice. Now, the next thing is we don't have our timing hooked up yet, so we want to do that. Okay, so here again, guys, we got the engine back up on our blocks of wood. And just as a reminder, make sure you keep that off of the valves down here. You'll notice that we've got the wood situated so none of the valves are sitting on it. Now we're going to look at the front of the engine and we got to look at this timing set. So this is our timing set. We've got a couple of gears here. And then of course we've got our new timing chain. Now, setting the timing up on these engines is actually, as far as getting them timed, is actually pretty easy, because it's basically similar to like your typical V8. There's a timing mark on the crank gear, and there's a timing mark on the cam gear, and they basically go dot to dot this way. Your crank gear is here, your cam gear is here, and we're just going to line those marks up so that they are dot to dot this way at about a 45-degree angle. So the first order of business is to rotate this cam around so that our mark is right where it needs to be. So we're going to take and put our gear on here. And this gear is only going to line up one way. It's designed that way on purpose so that it's timed. So it has a non-symmetrical bolt pattern. So I'm looking right there, and these two bolts are lined up, but that one's not. So that's not the right spot. So let's go to the next set of holes here. And right there, it looks like all three of my bolt holes are lined up. If I go to the next, if I go around again to them till they match up again, what I discover is that only two of them line up. So these bolt holes are not the same distance apart here. They're offset. It's kind of idiot proof. It keeps you from putting this thing on the wrong way. So right there, all three of my bolt holes are lined up. So that's where the cam gear goes. Now there's a couple of keys that go into this crankshaft. I've got new keys for it, and also this gear is pressed on, so it's a good idea to use some type of a pressing tool to get this on here. So I have a long piece of pipe with a spacer on it that I use to get these on, and I usually heat the gear up a little bit, not too much. I just get it warm so it goes on easier. Okay, so I'll do that. I'm going to get this gear on, and we'll come back and I'll show you how to line these up. Okay guys, so they have installation tools and so forth for this gear. I use a large piece of pipe and I tap that on there, but what I do before I do that is I take and I heat that gear up. I get it pretty warm. Heat the gear up for 2 or 3 minutes with just a propane torch. And of course use a pair of pliers to get it in place. Don't grab it with your hand. You don't have to get it super hot, but if you heat it for 2 or 3 minutes, it taps right on. You really don't want to beat on the end of this crankshaft. So if you're going to use a pipe or some long driver, make sure you heat the gear. Otherwise you got to really pound on that thing, and I don't recommend you do that. So now what we have here is I went ahead and put the engine at TDC, which put my crankshaft mark here. I've marked that. I'll zoom in on that a little bit. That's a better shot of it. Now there's 2 keyways that go in here. There's a big key slot here that takes this square key, and that's for the balancer. And then there's another key in there that locates this gear, which is like a Woodruff key. Now if you look closely, you'll see we've got our marks lined up here. These are our dots. When this dot is here, my piston is at top dead center. And then I just take and I put my gear on here and I rotate the cam around. I haven't put the chain on yet. It's a good idea to line these marks up, get your bolts in it, and make sure they're lined up. Once you get that done, then you can pull your gear off and put your chain on. Okay guys, so now we've got the chain on. I did a couple of things off camera. There's also, if you remember in the first video, there's a little oil tube that we put back in there. And then on the bottom side, we put the oil tubes in. There's an oil tube coming from the pickup strainer. The pump is picking it up. And then of course the pump is going to cross that over. And then there's another tube that comes out of the pump. And that is going to put the oil into the oil gallery over on the other side here. And of course we've got our pressure relief valve. Your pressure relief valve is going to go in right here. I haven't put that in yet, but that's basically how the oil tubing and so forth is set up on the bottom. So we're looking pretty good. We're making progress. I've already got the oil pump. I submerged it in oil and primed it, and so we've got the oil pump primed. We got the gasket here. I'm getting ready to put the oil pump on. We'll do that. We'll do that in the next episode. I think I'm going to cut this episode off. So the next episode will be the oil pump installation and then the valve adjustment. And at that point, then I get all the fancy parts from Chris and we start putting the external parts, the cylinder head and so forth on this. So I appreciate you watching, and I realize that not everybody's gonna have like a huge interest in this engine, but it's something different and unique, and I hope you enjoy these videos. If you have any questions or comments, ask below. I do appreciate you watching. I've also got the 427 Chevy that I'm going to continue work on for the S10, and the 440 Chrysler. Both of those two engines, I'm working on those and doing video in between, so we're going to finish those up. So thanks for watching, and I will talk to you very soon, I promise.